Hello, this is a recording based on a number of different things. I go along to a philosophy club every couple of months, and some of these subjects were discussed at the last one, and I had somebody who wanted to go but couldn't make it asked if I'd record some of the things talked about, and it also occurs to me that some of these issues might be useful for some of my students on the ethics degree, that they might be able to use some of these philosophical concepts in essays and what have you. So this is a sort of multi-purpose recording. But the discussion we had last month, or whenever it was, I'm losing track of time at the moment, was on the ideas of a Cameroonian philosopher called Achille Mbembe, who in his turn bases a lot of his ideas and concepts on notions which Michel Foucault, a French philosopher who died in the 1980s, he himself had put forward a load of ideas, and Cameroon was at one point in its history a French-speaking colony, so a lot of the educated middle and upper classes of Cameroon are fluent in French and study French philosophy and French art and French music and so forth at university. So there is a definite influence between France and Cameroon, which is probably why Mbembe is quite keen on Michel Foucault's ideas. He also picks up on ideas of postmodernists like Judith Butler and a few other people. But perhaps to start with, before we get more into the aspects of Mbembe's philosophy and ethics that I'm going to talk about to set some of the background, it's useful to mention a couple of ideas that Foucault came up with, because Mbembe has sort of responded to them with varying ideas and suggesting not that Foucault was wrong, but that his ideas didn't go quite far enough, or at least maybe that the world has changed since Foucault's day and needs to factor in a new sort of tier of ideas on top of what Foucault spoke about. So Foucault had ideas on every subject under the sun at some stage during his life, but particular things that are worth noting in this context at least are two interrelated ideas he had of this is the high-tech gadgetry and so not gadgetry, high-tech teaching aids, that's the word I'm looking for. Biopower was one of his ideas, and there's an interrelated concept which flows off of that, of biopolitics. Biopower is the wish to, well, not just the wish, the ability to control life, and it's something possessed by governments. A lot of Foucault's interest was in sort of big-scale governments of large countries, France, Germany, America, and so forth. Very big, large-scale governments and how they control people. But the same ideas would apply if you went to some very small tribe in the Amazon or deep in the African Congo or something like that, where you might have a tribal culture of 100-odd people. They would still have a leadership structure, a hierarchy, and that hierarchy would deal with issues of biopower and biopolitics, albeit on a much smaller scale than, say, the government of America or the government of China, or somewhere of that vast, massive scale. So what is, I'm just fiddling with things here in a second, what is biopower, what is biopolitics? Biopower is, say, the management of life, that if you are responsible for a group of people, whether that's a tribe of 100 people or a nation of several million people, then you are managing their lives, their bodies, in some sense. From a governmental or leadership point of view, you need them to do certain things. So if it's a very small-scale community, you might need them to be farming the fields, collecting firewood, hunting animals, that sort of thing. If it's a very large-scale, a massive modern society, you might need them working in factories, down coal mines. You might need them to be working in the shops, in hospitals, in schools. In order to go and do all of these things, other issues come into play. So you need people to have a certain level of education to do whatever it is that you need them to do. You also need them to have a certain level of health. So they've got to be well enough to go and manage certain things. And one of the situations that Foucault and various other people have touched on was that in the First World War, a lot of nations, European nations, realised that many of their poor people, whom they were hoping to sort of pack off into the armies to go and fight these vast battles, a lot of those poor people were very unhealthy, very malnourished, very diseased, not well enough to be soldiers, be sailors and so forth. They weren't sort of physically fit enough to go and die. If it was a bizarre way of putting it, but if you see what I mean. So suddenly they developed this interest in many European nations that the government started taking a lot more interest in things like healthy eating, in health checks, in fresh water supplies, housing stock conditions, particularly as they affect the working classes, to get them up to a level of health where they could be used as ground soldiers in the fighting battles across the European continent and so on. So suddenly it's, and this kind of, I suppose, is really Foucault's point, is that when governments take an interest in the health and bodily management of people, it's not always because they are compassionate, kind, caring, humanitarian individuals, and politicians, kings, emperors, tribal leaders, what have you. It's because they wish to utilise people in a certain way. And so if they appear to be helping people to better health, it may be sometimes with rather an ulterior agenda. And even when that ulterior agenda is not necessarily warfare, it's something else, it's still there. So you could argue, for example, that the modern British government has been running campaigns for a few years now, TV adverts and posters and one thing and another, with little plasticine figures is the latest thing in adverts saying, oh, get off the sofa, go and join a sports club, go and do some exercise, stop eating so much sugar, stop eating so much fat, do this, do that, do the other. Not because they're getting us ready for some grand scale warfare, I hope, but because if we just spend all of our time sitting on sofas stuffing our face with chips and sweeties, we'll end up enormous and unhealthy and raddled with illnesses, which will cost the NHS an absolute fortune, and will need time off work, and that will cost the economy in that way. So they're trying to reduce the cost to the government and ultimately, I suppose, the taxpayer, of looking after large numbers of unhealthy people. So the motivation isn't so much be healthy, you'll be a happy, jolly person. It's more be healthy, you won't cost us as much then. So it's more of a pragmatic kind of health concern and a way of managing bodies. Yeah, Foucault also looked at things like prison systems, the army, the navy, any kind of managed, contained body of people who had to be controlled, had to have their bodies managed in various different ways. Which is a very weird way of phrasing it, I know, but I can't think of a better way of putting it at the moment. And he spoke about the idea of discipline, so that, for example, a lot of prisons, at least up until relatively recently, would encourage their inmates to do sort of exercises and things like that, partly to kind of tire them out. So with lowered levels of energy, they'd be less likely to fight each other, less likely to fight the guards and that sort of thing. And give them activities to keep their minds occupied, keep their hands occupied, again, with the ultimate goal of keeping them manageable. You could say that psychiatric hospitals, for example, frequently medicate people who may not necessarily need to be sedated for health reasons, but are sedated because it can make them more manageable. That are less likely to have violent episodes or wander off and cause problems and so forth. So it's again about the management of people. Feminist scholars picking up on this have often focused in on the way women's bodies particularly are managed, and that, for example, in the aftermath of large-scale warfare, when the population has plummeted, there's often lots of pushes and drives and initiatives to get women back in the home, out of the factories where they've been doing the munitions, if we're going back to the Second World War, for example. Being able to go back home, find a husband, or their already existing husband who's returned from the field of battle, and get them to have children and give them tax breaks and benefits and child benefit, that kind of thing, to encourage repopulation. And yes, many people might have been really happy to be parents. So there is it's not that the government is utterly disinterested in whether people are happy or not, but it's more, I suppose, that their happiness or their good health or their contentment is a side issue, so long as they are doing what the government needs them to do, whether that is being healthy enough to fight in battles, whether that's being fit enough to go and till the fields or work in the factories, or whether that is having enough children to get the population back up after there's been a massive drop, whether due to warfare or, I suppose, in some points in history, plagues, famines, things like that. It's how do you get people to do what you want to make them more manageable? That's what biopower is. And biopolitics is the way in which that is implemented through policies and initiatives and this, that and the other. The kind of day-to-day implementation of biopower. So that's that kind of background. Mbembe came in and said, very interesting, what have you, these are fantastic ideas, but we need to also think about the flip side of this, which is necropower. And of course, where there is necropower, there is necropolitics. So biopower, biopolitics, the management of the living; necropower, necropolitics, the management of the dead, or at least those who may soon be dead, more to the point. So this is not so much how you manage cemeteries or anything in that way. Rather, it's saying that Mbembe's idea is that governments invest in those they want to live, those they want to be healthy, those they want to be useful in some way. At the same time, there is a disinvestment in those whose lives are deemed not worth the financing or the putting on initiatives and programs and schemes and one thing and another to keep them alive, to keep them healthy. So it can be thought of in two ways: a sort of a passive way and an active way. The passive way is deciding that group of people over there are not worth the effort of keeping alive, so let's just ignore them, leave them to their own devices. And if they come a cropper, if they become very unhealthy, or if they're engaging in activities that will drastically lower their lifespans and their survival rates, well, what are they? So an example of that, you could say, is homeless people in Britain. In the government, occasionally they chuck money at a charity or an initiative, but by and large, the homeless are just left to their own devices, and there are charities and churches and individual groups who run around with soup kitchens and so on, but that's not at a kind of governmental structural level, that's more at a sort of local initiative, human compassion level. So the overall aim is not to change housing policy, it's not to change investment in housing stock, it's not to set up drug rehab schemes to help people get off the streets. It's just to sort of say, well, if to paraphrase old Ebenezer Scrooge, if they die, they die, and it decreases the surplus population. What of it? Some groups of people are just left to their own devices. Typically people who are very, very poor, and you can certainly make the argument that perhaps the reason they become very, very poor is because they have been left to their own devices. They've been sort of relegated into a corner and not given the extra help, the extra support, the extra aid, which helps other groups of people to become financially better off and stay financially better off, move into the middle classes or indeed the upper classes. So they've been relegated to a corner and just left to basically die off. That's the sort of more passive approach. The more active approach is where governments say we want to get rid of that group of people over there as soon as possible, and so they start implementing things like the very, very obvious example would be the Nazis deciding to eliminate Jewish people and gypsies and gay people and disabled people and half the known universe, where there are expressed campaigns to round them up and kill them, murder them in some shape, guise or form. That can be governments doing it to their own people, as with the Nazis, trying to wipe out people initially in Germany and then in the various other countries that they conquered and brought under their rulership. But it can also be through warfare of exterminating groups of people in other countries, that the enemy, the foreigners in that country over there, we will attack them, maybe not every single one of them, but there may be sort of political factions that they want to wipe out the ones they're opposed to. And then there is another political faction in that country that the government waging the war would like to see as the new wave of leadership, the ones more sympathetic to their own goals, so they get rid of the group they don't like, and then help the surviving group to flourish and take over that country and declare peace. You can see that plenty of times in scenarios all around the world. We're lucky in Britain that we don't have active campaigns to slaughter our own citizens at the moment, but certainly the kind of death through neglect, through indifference, through underfunding. Close down another hospital, oh well, it's too far for you to go to get your critical medical care, and you might die a few years earlier than you otherwise would do, and the government just shrugs its shoulders and says, so what? Because that group of people is not valued enough, and this is Mbembe's idea, it's not valued enough to want to keep them alive. And again, just as he says all government, well, Foucault rather said all governments engage in the management of the living, that's just the nature of government and leadership, you have to do that. So Mbembe is saying all governments engage in the management of death. Their citizens will die in any country, even the happiest country on earth. Your citizens will die at some point, they're not going to live forever. How do you manage that? Do you try and prolong their life into their 80s, their 90s, these days their hundreds? Do you provide lots of support for the elderly? Or do you say, well, we'll keep them alive until they're 60 and then we'll start pulling back on the funding, so if they die when they're 70, and at some point, citizens who were being preserved have reached a stage in their life where the government no longer wants to preserve them. Does a given government decide that some people can be worse? So we sort of mentioned the feminist angle. You could say on the flip side of that, most people who die in war are men. Most people who die in street violence are men. Is this because governments are effectively saying male lives are expendable? If loads of men die, well, they die. What of it? Or at least those from certain social classes, perhaps. And you don't have to be a raging Marxist to see that sometimes governments that are composed of very, very rich people tend to be more sympathetic to other very, very rich people than they do to the very, very poor. So there is often a sort of an interest in government of looking after people like themselves, and much less interest in looking after people who socially are so far removed from those in power that they tend to get the crumbs from the table, the leftovers, rather than that sort of an active desire to help them, and that becomes a bit of an issue in itself. Returning momentarily to Foucault, one of his other ideas was the droit de glaive, the right to kill.